Hopefully we'll have time in the Q&A to pick up on some of what Katrina said in respect of that opportunity to catch up, if that is the right term, in respect of our comparison with some of the other EU member states, and then Europe in comparison with US and with China. She spoke a little bit about the ecosystem and about the significant role played by medical technology companies in that. We're going to focus a little bit on that, and we're going to focus particularly on the impact of recent regulation and the effect it's had on decisions about clinical trials, whether that be in the EU or in the US. We're going to do that through the good offices of a small plucky startup called Medtronic. 100 billion market cap, 100,000 roughly employees worldwide. There are a few organizations better placed to give us an insight into the clinical trial environment in the Medtech industry. And from Medtronic, we have a man who has spent more than 30 years working in the Medtech industry, particular focus on US, European and emerging market regulatory frameworks. He is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Medtronic. Please welcome John Kilmartin. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Anton. And I think the 30 years is a giveaway that I definitely went to UCG. My children went to NUIG. So delighted to be here, and like to reiterate the thanks to Martina and Peter and Martin for the invitation here today. I'm here representing Medtronic, but more importantly representing the Irish Medtech Association. So that's really all of the multinationals, the SMEs, the startups, or whatever. I said, a graduate of the university here, very proud to have lived in. Martina spoke about the Western Seaboard earlier, so very glad to have lived in the Northwest and the West. And the image, interesting, when I asked IBEC or IMA for the image for their standard introduction, they sent me this one, which happens to be Fanad Lighthouse off the northwest coast of Donegal, which was a beacon for many ships passing in the night. And interestingly, and if you get a chance today, to read through the 8 strategic priorities that the Institute has created, they're fantastic. And the first one talks about creating an international beacon for high-impact clinical research activity where partnerships are created and evidence is delivered. So from an industry perspective, Peter, we love the ambition, we really welcome it, and to use your own words, we should really go for it. So Katrina spoke about the pharmaceutical sector, and it's a fantastic sector in Ireland with a long history. I'm going to give you a little bit of context around the medtech sector here, and we're all very proud of the scale and the impact of the medical device or medtech sector in Ireland. It's really a huge success story over the last 30 years or so. You can see here some of the statistics. We're very proud of 80% of the world's stents, 75% of the world's orthopedics, and 40% of the world contact lenses. And maybe to put that in perspective, as I drove this morning from Parkmore on the east side of the city over here to the university, I passed by obviously the Medtronics, the Boston Scientifics, multiple startups, CLS laboratories, etc. And when we talk about that, one of my operations folks mentioned to me yesterday that today, from the start of this conference until the end of the day, approximately 15,000 stents and stent delivery systems will have been shipped out of this region to markets, hospitals, patients all over the globe. So that gives you just a tangible example. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the hub itself, and Barry Comerford from IMA will speak later this afternoon about it in more detail. A little bit about clinical trials, and I think what you'll see, similar to what Katrina said, I think we punch above our weight from a medtech sector, whether it's manufacturing or product development. But clinical trials, we've made some great progress, but I think for sure there is a great opportunity, and I think the Institute will have a huge part to play in that. I'll speak a little bit, as Anton mentioned, about the regulatory environment, both in Europe and in the US, and I think there's learnings from both. And then maybe to share with you some experiences that we have maybe learned over the past couple of years and over the past couple of weeks in particular, as I spoke to a number of the multinationals and a number of the startups. So this is just in numbers. I think it's fantastic. I think obviously we're recognized as a global medtech hub, 450 companies, digital health, and I know there's obviously a massive conference on in Dublin, today and over the next few days in the medtech sector. 75% of the global medtech companies here are also involved in research and development, and you'll see later that innovation and clinical research go hand in hand. And while I happen to come from a large multinational, the reality is that the indigenous medtech industry here, the SMEs and the startups, are really the engine room behind the innovation. In Ireland, obviously we're a small country, but we have the highest per capita number of people working in the medtech sector and the second largest exporter. So they're all, facts and figures that we're very proud of, but they're on the back of, and Katrina mentioned it, really hard work from multiple stakeholders over a long number of years. One thing as well we touched on earlier there, sometimes we can use our size as a small country very much to our advantage. So when I look at when drug-device combinations were a converging technology a number of years ago, we took our pharmaceutical and our traditional device industries and put them together and created a great ecosystem there. Likewise, now we're looking at obviously traditional devices, software, AI, digital, etc. And again, we have all of the ingredients there. Manufacturing, we definitely punch above our weight. We're world leaders in lean manufacturing, factory of the future, digital. Product development has evolved fantastically in this country in the medical device sector. To be honest, we started out, yes, it was kind of process, scale-up improvements, fixing widgets. Then it became, maybe a little bit of line extensions, and now it is truly pure product development and the R part of R&D. Shared services evolved from that, whether that's complaint handling organizations, regulatory affairs like my own function, etc. We have the academic, the physician community, and a number of whom are in the room here today who've been fantastic partners. So a lot of the support infrastructures are there. I put a question mark on the device clinical trials. Katrina mentioned the number of 70 plus, and I know in the device world, I think we're in, maybe 13 or 14 clinical studies last year. And that, we'll get some additional information later this afternoon from Dr. Ray Nolan from HPRA, who are really interested, not just in terms of, public health, but also in terms of innovation. So the opportunity for the ecosystem, I think it's important to look back before we look forward. This morning's theme is, vision for excellence, and I think it's important to look back first of all and see what can we learn. So the next 3 slides cover what I would describe as some initiatives over the past number of years that I've either been involved in or peripherally involved in. And the first was a really important report, and Professor Jim Egan and Jim Crowley from Galway here, and the industry associations and other groups were involved in creating this, what I would call, it was a clinical trials task force focused on medical devices. And they identified many of the challenges and barriers back in 2006. We've made improvements in a number of these, but as you can see, there's some of them that were even mentioned this morning. Somebody talked about the clinical trial nurses, etc., where there's definitely still room for improvement. The summary there said the need for Irish patients to access and benefit from new technologies, and the patient voice is key in all of this. We'll hear that constantly over the next 2 days. But it also highlighted that it's clear that a demand for improved clinical research structure exists. Fast forward, 2012, Ireland, a location of choice for medical technology clinical investigations. Again, impetus, efforts. The executive summary here, as we read, talks about a slight increase in the number of device trials, the establishment of the clinical research centres, improved ethics committee process, acknowledge some progress, but probably still a limited number of device trials in Ireland. And that's multifactorial. That's not today and next few days what you'll see. It is complicated. All of us as stakeholders have a role to play in that. And then 2019, a report from the Irish Medical Association back to government in terms of priorities. And again, highlight that a robust clinical research infrastructure can provide enormous value to Ireland's patient population and to the economy, as Katrina mentioned earlier there. The level of medtech clinical investigations taking place in Ireland still remains low, You see the second bullet point there that talked about companies would like to direct investment into clinical research if our infrastructure becomes more recognized. So I think, we need to build a brand. I think there's pockets of excellence, and the ingredients are there, and how we tie that together. And I genuinely believe that the Institute for Clinical Trials will play a huge part in that. This is just a sampling of, based on conversations over the past number of weeks and months and information from our members, etc., the progress to date. Obviously the establishment of the National Research Ethics Committees, the CRCs, the National Clinical Trials Office, agencies, HPRA support, and down below some of the organisations which are obviously an inherent part of the university here as well, including BioInnovate and Curam. So a lot of the ingredients are for sure there, but I think we need to ensure that we maximise those, and I think that's where the Institute can, as I say, play a huge part. So many of the pieces of the jigsaw, we need to piece it together. So the next couple of slides, I'll work through them pretty quickly, but before we look at where to next and how do we promote clinical research in a country like Ireland, we need to look at the regulatory environment, both in Europe and in the US, and some of the learnings to be taken from there. And it's not easy. This is, EU MDR, a number of you will hear about. This is the EU medical device regulations, which has come into place over the last number of years. It's really dominated our conversation in Medtech over the past number of years. And in many ways, the EU MDR as a regulation itself is fine, but we probably underestimated the ability to get all of our products through EU MDR. There was no grandfathering in of existing products, so therefore we had to try and get over 500,000 medical technologies through the system in a relatively short period of time. So that has unfortunately created a narrative about Europe, and therefore Ireland, that it can be difficult to do business in Europe at the moment. So we need to find a way to reverse that narrative, similar to the way in the US they reversed the narrative around clinical research, if you look at the narrative in 2012 versus the narrative in 2022. This is the regulation itself, well-intended. EU MDR was well-intended, ideally to strengthen patient safety, build trust. There were challenges with the regulation of devices, in Europe. Medtech industry has supported all of this, but I think we realized probably in the middle of last year that we were at a critical tipping point. There was a general acknowledgement by all stakeholders, the European Commission, industry, competent authorities, that at that point we only had 15% of our medical devices through the system, so therefore 85% of our devices still needed to get through. And you could see some of the narrative there, the narrative around that medtech companies were having to put innovation on hold as we tried to get through the bottleneck. Ireland was losing out as startups were choosing Europe to launch products over the US, and I think we see that as well. We see many of our startups coming through here, which are fantastic, using the early feasibility study program from FDA, maybe rather than going to a location here in Ireland or Europe. So common sense prevailed. Back in December at an EPSCO meeting, there was broad agreement that the industry needed some breathing space to clear that backlog, and the regulation and amending regulation was put in place, which very much welcomed. However, it has left what I would refer to as a lot of uncertainty, and therefore in some of the conversations with particularly with the multinationals, has created a question mark over Europe and innovation. So an unintended consequence, we need to learn from this. FDA. So some of our colleagues this morning, spoke about this, and I think there's a fantastic learning, for us. When we look back, I remember I attended a large cardiovascular conference, TCT, in the US in 2012, and the whole narrative at that point was, what does the US need to do to try and get clinical research back? And interestingly, back in September, TCT was in Boston, and it was almost, you could reverse the slide. It was almost like, what does Europe need to do now to get clinical research infrastructure, back in place? So there are learnings. FDA in 2012 had acknowledged a significant decline in the proportion of new device clinical studies performed in the US. And they acted. And it didn't necessarily take regulation. It took a willingness, it took a mindset, it took really good guidance documents and training of FDA reviewers. So that was a real concerted effort. Now that gives us hope, because I think, you can see that where there's a will, there's a way, and that very much transpired from a US perspective. FDA's messaging as well, which is a learning for us. It's not just about protecting public health, but also advancing public health. And I think, as we saw with the patient story this morning, that's really key. Timely patient access to high quality, safe and effective devices. And also medical device innovation starts with clinical research. Early feasibility studies, I won't go into the mechanics of it. It was one of a number of initiatives that FDA brought us through at the time. Breakthrough device designation. Patient preference studies were in a very structured way. The voice of the patient was built into the risk-benefit ratio. And then early feasibility study. Very, very successful. Initial adoption was slow. Naturally, FDA were a little cautious, industry were cautious, IRBs were cautious. But as I said, where there's a will, there's a way. And it got to this point where now multiple startups, multiple multinationals are using the early feasibility study program. So it's something we need to look at. Is there an opportunity for us in Europe to do something similar? So with the creation of the Institute, what are our opportunities? And for that, I think there's probably, I've looked at this probably in two ways. One is if we look at our startups and our SMEs, and then we look at our multinationals. If I start with the multinationals, first of all, this is somewhat based on anecdotal feedback, and one of the suggestions I would have in relation to the Institute is a structured reassessment of the user needs. We all have our biases, including ourselves in industry, as to what is needed. So I think a really structured reassessment of user needs would be fantastic. This is just some feedback from the multinational. There's a really strong appetite to increase activity, both the number and type of clinical studies in Ireland. And that comes from both our commercial, which Martina referred to, and also our R&D teams. We need to influence the decision makers. So because there's a large presence of some of the large multinationals here, it doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is right or that we will be chosen over another country. So we need to highlight that we can generate high quality data, adequate clinical support staff, etc. We need to get on the radar, and a few wins. If we get on the radar, then all of a sudden that builds momentum. And I use the early feasibility study as that example. Once you get on that radar and then execute, I think that's really important. Clinical trials to complement R&D. So we've really evolved our research and our innovation work in Ireland. The next natural instinct of that is our engineers and scientists want to trial that device locally, whether that's first in human studies, whether that is early feasibility studies or whatever. So that is the next natural complement. And can we position ourselves as a hub for EFS studies? I know the European Commission are looking at how, in Europe, can this be done? R&D funding, tax credits. So I think there's a great opportunity to create the environment and promote the wins. The feedback from the SMEs obviously is different, but a lot of, obviously when you're smaller, the whole process for clinical trials can appear complicated, it can appear confusing. Sometimes we assume that everybody knows what everybody else is doing in the infrastructure, whether it's ethics committees, CRDOs, the hospital groups, the HPRA, etc. Often, I've spoken to a number of SMEs over the last number of days in particular, often they will have a great physician locally, but by the time they jump through the hoops and try to get over a number of the hurdles, that can be too late, and therefore it may be a simpler option for them to do that study elsewhere, and particularly in the US. We do need that critical mass of support infrastructures. So the key thing particularly for industry is consistency. What you don't want is one clinical trial going well, you build a little bit of momentum, and then the next one, there's a little bit of a blip. So I think having that critical infrastructure whereby it's there, you know it's there, and if we take on a clinical trial in Ireland, you know that it's going to be completed, data integrity with efficiency. So that's the feedback from the SMEs. So in summary, what I would say is, from the Institute, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us. Be ambitious, learn from others. I think, I've just given the FDA as one example. There are many others. We need to build a reputation. We have the cluster in Ireland, and particularly, in the west of Ireland. How do we become that location of choice for clinical trials? Structured needs assessment, reassessment, I think would be a really nice thing to do. Again, we all have our biases. What does clinical trial, clinical research mean to the academic versus the physicians versus the startup versus the multinationals? We may pick and choose which areas to go after initially. Positive impact locally, we've seen that. Patient first mindset, as Katrina and others have alluded to. And really, I think from strategic priority number 1 of the Institute, becoming that international beacon for high-impact clinical research. That's the aspiration, that's the ambition. And when you look at every other part of our sector in Medtech, we have punched above our weight, we've met that ambition. I firmly believe there's no reason why we cannot become that international beacon with the Institute and all of the stakeholders. And maybe, Anton, to go back to the sporting analogy, when all else fails, pump that ball into the full forward. So what I would say is that the Institute can be that full forward, that focal point for stakeholders. So thank you very much. Look forward to the rest of the day and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.